So you likely had, or some of you likely had, the same reaction to Kant's categorical imperative that his contemporaries had at the time that he articulated it. And that is a response of, huh? It's like, seriously? You expect me to, on a day-to-day basis, as I'm confronting the various dilemmas I have to contend with, to explore the inherent logical qualities of the particular actions that I'm taking? This seems completely counterintuitive and not a very practical way or practical ethic for living. And so Kant responded by saying, okay, dummies. I'll take another stab at this. I'll give you kind of the dumbed down version of it. I'm really going to be explaining or describing the same thing, but it'll look different to you. But it's really not the same thing. It's called the means ends principle. And this was Kant's second attempt at coming up with a system of ethics that's based on logic and reason and human dignity. And it works like this. Kant says, I'm going to assume some things. Okay, I'm going to assume that humans are the source of values in the world. Without humans, there would be no values, and if there's no value, nothing has any worth. So again, remember what Kant is operating off the assumption that non-human animals are fundamentally different from human animals in that the non-human animals lack the capacity for rationality. They're completely instinctual creatures, and as such, would not have the ability to conceptualize things like value or worth. So this is something that's unique to human beings. The things that are said to have value in the world have that value because humans assigned that value. And if there were no humans, those things would not have that value. They'd exist, but they wouldn't have that value. This is to say that human beings are the necessary condition of worth. Okay? Without human beings, you don't have worth. Therefore, human beings are necessary for anything to have value or worth. As a necessary condition of worth, human beings are worthy. In other words, they possess dignity. Human beings can't assign to other things what they don't have themselves. So if human beings are assigning worth to the things that exist, then that must mean that human beings themselves have value and worth. In other words, they are intrinsically valuable human beings, not just instrumentally valuable. They're valuable not just for what can be done with them or what their usefulness is, but because they have an inherent sense of worth that they then assign to other things that exist in the world. So Kant boils this down into the maxim, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. So think back earlier to when I mentioned talking with folks about service workers and how degrading it can feel when you're a service worker and a customer doesn't acknowledge that you're a human being. They kind of treat you like a flesh and blood machine that's providing some sort of service for them that they want. So you go into the coffee shop and the barista greets you and serves you your coffee, and you don't return the greeting and you don't express any gratitude. That would be a clear violation of the means ends principle, according to Kant. He doesn't want you, he doesn't necessarily think that you should be getting all up in the life of this other person and getting really personal. It just means that when you're going to have an interaction like you will with somebody who serves you coffee, you've got to make some sort of a gesture that acknowledges that this person is a subject of their own life that's separate from the service that you're providing, they're providing you. And so a gesture like, hey, how's your day going? Might be enough for Kant when you get the cup of coffee. Now, as the intensity of the engagements you have escalate, so is the degree to which you're going to have to, or the lengths you're going to have to go to acknowledge that this other person is an ends in themselves. So the low level might be the person that I get the coffee from, or the person who checks out your groceries at the grocery store. But it's going to be at another level probably when you talk about like instructors and students. The instructors probably got to go a little bit further. They've got to go a greater distance. That's what you do when you don't know which word to choose. You're going to have to go a little bit of a greater distance when you're dealing with students, because students are, if they're studenting right, they're making themselves much more vulnerable than the person at the coffee shop is, right? That the student is coming to you and saying, I trust you to not lie to me. There's some things that I don't know that I'm depending on you to help me learn. And to admit to you that I don't know something is a state of vulnerability. And I recognize that because you have greater knowledge of this subject than I do, that as a student, when I come to you, I'm putting my trust in you. So an instructor is probably, if they're going to fulfill Kant's means ends requirement, they're going to have to go a little bit of an extra length to show the student that they're worthy of that trust, that they recognize the value of the student's life to themselves, and understand that value enough. And so they're going to probably have to do more. And this kind of is going to apply to the different relationships that we have. And so you think about prostitution, or now what's sort of called sex work, which is sort of a problematic phrase, but anyway, we won't get into that. If you think about the nature of the relationship between a prostitute or sex worker and a client, well, this is many steps above the professor-student relationship. This is when we're both parties engaged are bringing much more of themselves to this interaction. And so it's probably going to require more of both to demonstrate that each sees the other not simply as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves, right? And then doing this, Kant is going to say, is probably going to make both seeking the services of a sex worker or providing the services of a sex worker highly problematic. How do you acknowledge that you see a client who's coming to you for sexual services? How do you acknowledge that you see them as an end in themselves in a meaningful way? What's the gesture you make? Because we're talking about more than coffee and academics here. We're talking about people who are bringing enormously important parts of their identities to this interaction. Well, it's probably going to require a level of engagement with this person that starts to really compromise some of the fundamental features of sex worker client relationships, right? You can think about how this might apply to something like waterboarding or other forms of torture. Is there a way to torture somebody that acknowledges their humanity, that acknowledges their worth as something other than just a means to your ends? When you waterboard somebody and you give them the experience of absolute terror in hopes that that will serve your ends of getting information, is there any way you can sort of compensate for that treatment in a way that makes them realize, like, oh no, it's cool. I still see you as a human being with worth and dignity in and of yourself, regardless of your usefulness to me. And Kant would say, well, no, you're just using these people. There's no level to which you can engage, or at which you can engage and have your acknowledgement of this person's dignity still be clear, right? So things like this would probably be off the table for Kant. So means ends principle. Always treat others as an end in themselves, never just as a means. Of course, people are means to our ends. You're means to my ends, right? If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be collecting a paycheck. I'm a means to your end. You wouldn't, without me, you wouldn't be getting the credit for this course that you want to pursue your educational goals. But we treat each other as human beings. We acknowledge each other's humanity when we communicate back and forth with one another. And we acknowledge that there are things going on in your life and things going on in my life that matter to you and matter to me. And when we do things like that, we're respecting Kant's means ends principle.